Cool.
on our
One, 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 two.
We're just checking. We're just checking.
Testing sound. Good morning.
I have to repeat myself.
Good morning. How are you? Nice to see you. Welcome. Testing sound 1, 2. Okay. We need to check the others as well. Is mine off now? Mhm. Say a few words into the mic.
Any words? That's okay. You want to check the volume? I don't think that's loud enough. Huh?
I'm just gonna go down.
Sure, sure. I would love that. It's been hard, to be honest. It's been really hard.
Can you please say
There we go. That's fine, eh? That's fine. Let me turn this off before.
anything? Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. No. Simply going to say we can't hear this. Testing. It's soft. It's soft. Testing, testing, 1, 2. Testing, testing, 1.
Well, not early, you are on time. But I think we're going to give it another 5 minutes just in case the rain has kept people away. We are waiting for one more panelist as well. So another your questions. Thank you.
Testing, testing, 1, 2, 1, 2.
And Professor Arthur reminds me that there's coffee and goodie bags outside for you. So if you need a little something, please help yourself as well while you wait.
One, two, 1, 2, testing, 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 1, 2, 1, 2, testing, 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 1, 2, 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2. Yeah, good.
I'm a panelist.
Good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen, fellow colleagues, esteemed guests, students. A very warm welcome to you on this cold Cape Town morning to the first in our series of important dialogues at the University of the Western Cape. This dialogue is an important one, and it takes forward for the campus an opportunity to start discussing important issues that were flagged during the inaugural address of our new rector, Professor Balfour. I'm not going to say too much because our facilitator, Prof. Nadar, is going to say more of that. But it's my great pleasure to call upon our rector and vice chancellor, Professor Balfour, to greet you this morning and to share a few thoughts in terms of framing the importance of this dialogue. Thank you very much, Professor Balfour.
Good morning, everybody. Dumela, Goeiemorgen, Sanibonani. It's really a thrilling opportunity for us, I think, to be together today. It's a cold day and people have come out despite inclement weather, as they say. It's always like a very gentle sounding word for a rough experience, inclement. And as Prof. Pathan noted, it's the first of our series, so I do want to begin by thanking you, each of you, for coming to make this possible. We also have colleagues who are online as I stand it, so we gave that opportunity for people who might not be able to make it in person also to listen online and participate online. And I want to acknowledge Prof. Sean Pather and Ms. Louise Dippenaar for their leadership in assisting me, aiding me in terms of putting together the initial thinking around this opportunity. It's not the only opportunity of its kind, I have to say, and it's not the end of a conversation today, but hopefully rather the beginning of a series of convocations. We joined this morning by Prof. Crain Soudien, who's a well-known figure in our sector, a specialist and Professor Emeritus at the University of Cape Town, Professor Kelly Gillespie from the Department of Anthropology, our SRC President, Mr. Mcntosh Khasembe, Professor Moeniba Isaacs from the Institute for Land Poverty and Agrarian Studies. I attended their online graduation this week. I think it was the warmest online ceremonial I've ever attended in my life. It was really quite wonderful. And our thanks also to the Respondent Panel. Among us this morning is Dr. Richard Pithouse, Distinguished Research Fellow at the Global Center for Advanced Studies, Dr. Fikile Vilakazi, Director for the Gender Equity Unit, Professor Rajendra Chetty from the Department of Language and Education. Thank you very much. We also go back a long way. And Prof. Lindokuhle Mandyoli from the Department of Political Studies. Lindokuhle, thank you so much also for contributing to today. So this series forms part of a deliberate process to help shape the future of our institution in relation to its esteemed past. As many of you know, these dialogues are part of a broader consultative effort linked also to the development of our institutional operating plan, so that when we talk about what and who we are as UWC in these conversations, that infuses also the planning around what we do with what we have, our wonderful human resource, our other resources, our place and our space is all part of that conversation. And so what we do here ultimately, I think, should have a way of influencing the strategic directions of the university. So although this is the first of a series of discussions, please, I think, also understand that when we're listening together today, we're listening with a view to what our future looks like as UWC. We're listening with an intent of shaping a future in as much as we can in the circumstances we find ourselves. Let's set the bright star, the lodestar for ourselves. The themes and strategic focus that we'll be exploring this year flow from engagements held during my onboarding as a Vice Chancellor towards the end of last year, and also from the feedback I gathered from US staff. There are many conversations, some informal, some more formal settings, and I undertook in that period to really do less talking and more listening and learn as much as possible from you. And I hope also that learning we'll share with each other in the course of the morning's discussions. And since the beginning of the year, a number of engagements have surfaced important insights, such as the need in an academic environment for responsiveness of our community, and the need for equality and belonging as fundamental human impulses that must also shape an academic community. People talk to me about the university and what it feels like to be here. And one of my colleagues in passing said to me the other day, I came here because of this association of the university with a particular past and the left tradition, and I'm still waiting to feel that. So that's quite an insightful, off-the-cuff remark, and it stayed in my mind. What does it? How does who we are shape how we be together and affect each other, so to speak? And these are not linked to, these should be linked, is what I mean, to all the conversations we have around, for example, strategy and financial resources and people and the important role of our students and student growth and the holistic development of staff and students should all kind of be integrated in a way or touched on by these dialogues that we have with each other. And I think as an institution, we should afford ourselves an opportunity to talk about this particular matter today. Given who we are as the University of the Western Cape, where we've come from, it's an important opportunity that we should afford ourselves today. So the conversations address both big picture ideas as well as the everyday institutional challenges. And broadly speaking, there are two categories planned for this year. The first is focused on the overarching ethos and our institutional strategy. And the second set is more aligned, more tightly, if you like, with the IOP goals like the academic project, people and culture, sustainable resource planning. But today's first session, and it's right that we begin on this note, I think, revitalizing the intellectual agenda of the left, invites us to re-engage with the university's history as a living resource, not as an artifact of the past, and to learn and share with each other about what we think we take forward as institution in relation to that past, what is important to us and why in relation to that past. Future dialogues will include other themes that are also sufficiently broad, capacious enough, like universities as place, space, and circumstance, and our university, our physical situation, and our identity. How do those come together? How would we like to shape that going forward? And of course, last but not least, is what I'm terming the UWC way. When we talk about the experience of UWC and the UWC way of doing things, what do we mean by that institutionally? And again, in passing conversations with people, they think, some colleagues have said to me, the UWC way is countless forms and processes, and and so that's the UWC way. But I'm sure if we had to ask ourselves, what would we like the UWC way to be, we could come up with quite a number of insightful solutions that unlock the heaviness of those processes that don't always integrate well with each other either. So it's an open session for everybody across our campus, whether you attend in person or participate online, or you've submitted written inputs. We welcome all of those inputs today, and it is the start of many conversations. And let me end by thanking you for committing to today, to being together. The dialogues only really become meaningful when we talk together. And I'm so looking forward to that. And I promised Prof. Nadar that I would speak less and listen more. And I hope I have committed to realizing that promise. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor, and good morning, colleagues, professors, students, thinkers, comrades, and dare I say, dreamers. Thank you all for being here today. In spite of the full drama of the Cape Town's very dramatic winter performance, for me, it's the wind, the broken umbrellas, but mostly as a Durban girl, it's that sideway rain. That stuff that comes and hits you on the side of the face. But in spite of all of this, you've shown up today, and we're really grateful that you are all here and that you are participating. For those of you who are participating online, I don't even know where to look, but welcome, and we'd like you to participate as fully as is possible for you. So, as the Rector mentioned, today's dialogue grows out of something both deeply historical and, I think, given the current moment, also urgently present in the current moment. It began in a conversation with our Vice Chancellor, who in his inaugural address invited us to reflect meaningfully on UWC's legacy and future as what Jake Scherwel once named the intellectual home of the left. Now, whether we say intellectual home of the left or intellectual home of the intellectual left, I think that the difference in syntax might not be trivial, right? Some argue that the one centers ideology and the other centers identity. But what strikes me most, and I think what's most important in the definition, is the word intellectual. Because in an era of metrics, of fast-paced outputs, of quantifiable productivity, the idea of intellectual life that is serious, that is ethical, that is engaged, that is slow, and thoughtful, I think matters more than ever. And so, more than the grammar, we are here to reflect on what this naming means in a moment when some actually believe that we've outgrown the politics of resistance, that we're post-apartheid, post-struggle, some even say post-truth. So there are whispers that leftist commitments are now a liability, especially in our institutions of higher learning, and that budget cuts come for the brave, they tell us. And yet, here we are. We've still shown up today. So allow me to also just introduce myself before we begin. I'm trying to, Sean, maybe you can help me. I'm Sarojini Nadar, and I'll be facilitating this morning's dialogue. I hold the Desmond Tutu South African Research Chair in Religion and Social Justice here at the University of the Western Cape. And I felt that, I come to this dialogue because in my own field, which is the field of religion and theology, I've seen how the radical spirit of Black and liberation theology that was so clearly articulated by, the likes of Steve Bantu Biko, Alan Bussack, Desmond Tutu, is in post-apartheid South Africa diluted into a language of what people have now named public theology, a discourse that largely avoids race, avoids questions of power, and avoids discomfort, as though apartheid's formal end meant the end of struggle itself. But I think all of us here know that struggle only changed its shape. From Gaza to Sudan, from the climate crisis to the commodification of education, from gender-based violence to resurgent fascism across the globe, the world demands new forms of clarity and, dare we say, older forms of commitment. And so that's why today is not just about nostalgia, though there is a lot to be proud of in our history of struggle and resistance as an institution, but it is about reckoning with the present. We are in a world where Trump has returned in all his devastating power, where we are all on tenterhooks wondering about the next steps of Iran and Israel, where people live under occupation and apartheid and die without media attention. And all of this impacts the university. It impacts funding decisions, research priorities. It impacts who gets to speak and what counts as neutral and objective production of knowledge. And so I want to especially invite colleagues and students today, especially from the natural sciences, the health sciences, the biomedical, and the economic and commerce fields. I want to invite you especially into this conversation as well, because I think too often people think that these matters are the sole preserve of those of us who are in the humanities and the social sciences, and it isn't. From antiretroviral access to AI design, from climate data to drug trials, from ecological collapse to bioethics, the question of justice is embedded in every form of knowledge production. So whether you are working in the lab or in the field or with texts, what we are discussing today belongs to all of us in the university context. And in a context where universities are increasingly shaped by neoliberal and market pressures, where we are asked to do more with less, to justify ourselves through spreadsheets and outputs, it is even more vital and more significant to ask, what are we building? Who are we becoming? And what kind of university do we want to be? And so this is why I'm really proud that UWC, which was forged in struggle, continues to hold space for this kind of conversation. So thank you all for being here. Now, let me say a few words before we begin with our distinguished panel about how we'll be holding space together this morning. As you can see, this is not your conventional academic panel. It's not a session where a sage stands on the stage and delivers a keynote and is applauded for their profundity, while the rest of us sit quietly in awe. We've deliberately and intentionally structured this conversation differently. Why? Because we want the form to reflect the content. If we are talking about intellectual community, if we are talking about co-production of knowledge and collective critique, then the way we speak together must embody that. So this morning is structured as a conversation. What I'll do is I'll first introduce each panelist individually, and thank you to the Rector for doing some of that for me already. And then they'll respond to a guiding question briefly for about 2 minutes, I've said. But I mean, we're all academics here. We'll see how they go. And then after that first round, we'll move into a more fluid conversation, drawing links and offering responses. And then we'll open the space for audience engagement. For those of you who are joining us online, you can post questions, I think, in the chat, if I'm not mistaken. And for those of you who are here, and you may not be that person who wants to, take the mic at the end and ask a question, we're also trialing something here where you can scan the QR codes that you'll find on seats next to you, or this code here. And you can pose questions or comments as we go along. And that will appear as we are in conversation up here, so people can participate in the conversation in different ways. I'm not sure I'll be able to catch all the questions that will appear here or the comments, but I think that they contribute to the larger conversation, and it's important, if you want to get up a point there, to just use your QR code and put up your questions if you like. But when we move to audience questions, there will be roving mics, and you can carefully plan your question, please. We're inviting you to ask a question or make a comment, not give a paper you weren't invited to give. So I will be very strict with time, and I will be sure to ask you, is there a question in that? And I'll try to do that as politely as possible, though diplomacy might not be my greatest strength, I can't promise. And finally, just to say, in terms of the space, this is a space for rigor, it's a space for disagreement, but it's also a space for care. So let's speak bravely, but also listen courageously. And I think it's important to challenge without attacking, and to stretch our thinking without shutting each other down. So just a few principles for our conversation today. And so we're going to begin this morning by inviting each panelist to locate themselves in this conversation. I'm going to ask them to do it personally, politically, professionally, however they'd like. And this is an invitation, really, as we spoke about in our briefing, to speak from where you stand in your scholarship, in your activism, in your institutional experience, and your various commitments. So it is now my pleasure to begin with Professor Crain Soudien. As you've heard, Crain is a sociologist whose work has deeply shaped our national conversations around identity, education, and transformation. He is Emeritus Professor at the University of Cape Town, up there on the hill. And many of you will know him from the famous Soudien report, I think, which helped reframe institutional approaches to transformation in higher education across the country. So, Crain, I'll begin with you. You have, I think, from our briefing, an intimate knowledge of this idea of UWC as the intellectual home of the left. How do you understand your own relationship to this idea now, in this moment? How do you locate yourself within it as someone who perhaps has walked alongside it, and someone who may or may not have been shaped by it?
Thank you very much, Sarojini, and thanks for asking me to be here. So I don't know how I do that in 2 minutes.
I might give you an extra minute.
But first of all, just to say that it's really important at some point that we talk about this debate that Neville Alexander had with Jakes about the use of this term, the University of the Left. It's not irrelevant in terms of what I want to say. But let me go straight to your question. I am now at this particular point in writing about higher education deeply invested in thinking about this idea of the university. And so I'm coming at this and I have opportunity to come to it through invitations like this, many times, with a not a manifesto, but an attempt to try and explain what I think I'm seeing in front of me. So the first big point that I want to make is that we don't have a sociology of higher education. We just don't. We've got a sociology of education, and sociology of higher education is like a kind of subset of that. But the only person who has really effectively given us a sense of what this thing is, the university, is a man called Martin Trau. Okay? And he wrote in the middle of the 1990s, and it was very useful. And I still use it quite intensely. But what Martin Trau was really doing was giving us an ethnography of the university in economically advanced countries. It was really about Harvard, Cambridge, Princeton, those kinds of institutions. Now, it's not irrelevant, but it doesn't get us to this point of understanding how subject formation happens in a university, how people come to a sense of their identities, the roles of disciplines, the ways in which universities govern themselves, the kinds of institutional cultures they develop, and so on. And the way in which Trau comes to it is essentially to remove the university from its bigger ecological context. What I'm trying to do is to bring that back into play. And the way in which I am doing it is to talk about insiders and outsiders in the university. Now, there are clearly insiders, people who are inside of the universities, and people who are called professors are the major, in some ways, shapers and influencers of what the universities are. But so are students. And it's in that relationship of how students and professors interact that character of the institution emerges. And you have to understand that. And I think it's really crucial coming to think about UWC that you understand that. You understand what that relationship is. Because the insiders are holding on to a kind of global idea of what the university is, which is not a bad idea. I'd like to defend that idea. And that idea is essentially that you are dealing here with a space which gives a moratorium to young people for suspending the realities of the world. In particular, the urgency of finding work, right? They're given, and what it does, it takes them through a protected moment where they are introduced to really intense things, the intensity of physics. I mean, you just think about it. The intensity of thinking through the logic of physics, thinking through the logic of social theory. Now, of course, people can learn all of that stuff on the street, but the university gives you this moment of protection. And I'd like to protect that. I'd like to think that, this is a real privilege of what the space is all about, needs protection. But you need to understand how people come into it, our people come into that space, because they don't come empty-handed. The students are not coming there knowing absolutely nothing. They come with a sense of the spaces and the ways in which power operates around them. And that interaction, as it bubbles into the university, produces powerful, powerful dynamics. And the professors, if they understand what their vocation is all about, are ripe for thinking about the possibilities that come out of that interaction. And their major mission is essentially to disrupt professors, to disrupt the conventions, the status of the establishment thinking that is in and around them. And so this is the last thing I want to say. So I've been making my mission over the last few years to understand in the world how neoliberalism in particular is eroding the capacity for professors to do that through performativity in the main. And how we are seeing around the world radical disruption being cut off, being terminated, being absolutely smothered by bureaucracy, by the kinds of cultures of the neoliberal corporate world.
Yes.
And we have this tragedy, and this is, I've tried to draw a map of this, of looking at how the disruptive idea in higher education has not survived almost anywhere. I'll give you examples. The University of Antioch has closed down. I don't know how many people know that. Closed down. A college in Seattle called Evergreen, which was a public institution deliberately established to promote the idea of an alternative world, is under such threat at the moment that the university is probably going to lose itself. I've been deeply involved with the work of Catherine Adora Hoppers. Catherine Adora Hoppers in 2015 was literally chased out of UNISA. Coming to Catherine Adora Hoppers' annual engagements, as I had the privilege to do, was a man called Professor Lutu. He established an institution called the Marcus Garvey University in Uganda. It lasted 1 year.
Wow.
So the major point that I want to say, and I say to Robert, is the real difficulty of being able to sustain disruption inside of a university. And we've got to be really thinking hard about how to hold in protection the ways in which disruption can be cultured, can be nurtured, because dominance is being nurtured in deep, deep kinds of ways, all the time.
Yeah.
So you've got to be thinking about how you develop cultures that are able to reproduce themselves, that don't disappear the minute Jakes is gone. Jakes is gone, pshoo, the whole thing reverses itself.
Yeah.
So I just want to leave you with a reading here. Bonnie Honig is a political philosopher, and she's written about, and she uses this term catachresis. I say to you, it's a really powerful term. The way in which I, in my kind of butcher thinking, deal with it is to say it's doing the wrong thing for the right reason.
Yeah.
How do you do the wrong thing for the right reason? And think about a university in those kinds of terms. So, sorry, I probably spent more time.
Thank you so much, Crain. That was deep and rich and reflective, and I think a good place to start our conversation. I think so much of university life, especially in the neoliberal corporate space, is about managing disruption. And it's interesting and refreshing to hear that perhaps our goal as a university is to sustain that. And how do we sustain that in ways that are meaningful? I think that's a good way to actually move to our next panelist, Kelly. Kelly is a political and legal anthropologist here at UWC. She's been involved in grassroots organizing across queer, feminist, anti-racist, and anti-Zionist movements. Kelly, as someone who has lived and worked at the edges of institutions, I think it might be a nice way to describe your work inside and outside, as Crain has said. How do you personally situate yourself in this idea of the intellectual home of the left?
Thank you, Sarojini. And I think what I want to begin with picks up a lot on what Crain just said. And I'll maybe start a little bit biographically, because that's often a nice way in. I had finished my PhD and I took a job at WITS, and I worked at WITS for 10 years. And in the beginning of my time there, I absolutely loved working there. And I loved working there because there was when I arrived, there was a vibrant critical conversation about the meaning of the university, about what it meant for a historically white university to be grappling with its place in a post-apartheid political landscape. The committees were robust. It wasn't a form-filling exercise. Committees were robust. Senate was robust. There was a lot of protest going on all the time, on a range of issues, including on the outsourcing of service workers, on Palestine, on student fees, way before the Fees Must Fall movement, on sexual violence on campus. The university was understood as a place where big social questions could be asked. And there was, I think this goes to Crain's point, there was a kind of relative safety on campus to be able to ask big social questions and engage with them. So I wouldn't say it was a suspending of the reality. It was an engagement with the reality of our society in somewhat relatively protected, safe conditions, right? And that's what I loved about it. It felt like the very big questions were being asked on campus, and there was an appetite on campus to be able to allow for those questions to develop under often quite extreme conditions of conflict. And in the midst of that, the relationship between students' own social transformation, their subject formation in the context of this knowledge they were learning, the grappling with these questions, in the context of thinking the deepest, biggest social questions on campus, conflagration was inevitable. And so there was a Senate task team that was set up to deal with the question of student protest and how the university could manage student protest. And there was an extraordinary democratic process where the task team went around and spoke to the constituencies of the university, engaged with the history of the university during the apartheid period, the colonial period. And they came up with a really extraordinary policy document that said that there should never be police on campus. And that the university should take responsibility for developing a safety protocol that fundamentally welcomed protest, that understood that protest, especially from students, was foundational to what a university should be. Because it is about confrontation with the most serious issues of our time. And without protest, we couldn't have a viable democracy, right? And so the university had a special obligation to protect students' right to protest and to hold the maximal view on what our relationship to radical confrontation should be as a contribution to democratic practice in our society. Now, that policy document on student protest was finalized and adopted just before the Fees Must Fall uprisings of 2015. And within a few months, policy document had been utterly thrown out the window and the careful democratic process that had produced it was annihilated in favor of the calling of riot police and private security onto campus. And the astonishing ease with which democratic process was shelved for state violence was so profoundly shocking, because what it indicated was that the university had failed its own task. It had failed to understand how to build an infrastructure of safety and capacity to be able to hold the biggest questions with the most space. And seeing students shot at, tear gassed, stun grenaded, arrested was so horrific, and often justified by decolonial theorists and Black feminists and people whose written orientation was trustworthy, but their practical orientation in terms of the actual politics of the institution was not. And so this is the reason why I left WITS, because what I saw in the immediate aftermath was the rolling out of a biometric security system on campus, the putting up of cameras everywhere on campus, the insourcing of a permanent anti-protest unit on campus that was headed by a senior member of the police force. And it was horrific to see the democratic infrastructure of the university simply dismantled. And the last I heard was that at WITS, students wanting to protest on Palestine now have to prove that they can pay for their own security before they're allowed to have a protest. I'm not sure about this, post 2023, but the democratic culture that I knew and respected at WITS was really undone. And I think this, I came to UWC hoping things would be different, but what I've heard was that, in fact, some of the historically Black universities were even more violent in their police and private security response against students. And I think this is one of the rounds of violence, particularly against the student movement, that has produced a kind of quietude, political quietude on campuses across the country that I think is extremely dangerous for our democratic project at large. I know that some of the court interdicts that were put in place at that time are still in place. So you have a kind of permanent right to call policing onto campus at any point at universities across the country. So this is not certainly suspending a reality. This is. I didn't mean it like that. I know. I'm riffing off of you to say that we need to retrieve something of very seriously something of a democratic project that has been smashed by the most recent round of protests. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm hearing lots of affirmation of this. Thank you so much, Kelly. Before I introduce our next panelist, I want to remind you that you can comment as you go along. If you don't want to just click your fingers, if you want to, that there are QR codes. And am I right that we will screen as we go along if you are making comments? If you go to the QR code, I think it says ask a question. You don't only have to ask a question. You can put in a soundbite there if you want, and it will feature on our screen. So I'd like to bring in Mcntosh Khasembe, our SRC president here at UWC, a long-standing student activist. Mcntosh is pursuing a Bachelor of Commerce with majors in industrial psychology and economics. Am I right?
Yes.
That's correct. Okay. He is also, as many of us have discovered this year, an orator of note. So I'm not sure if he's going to stick to his 2 minutes. But Mcntosh, I want to invite you to reflect, not just as a student representative, but I think as a young intellectual coming into your own in this space. Where do you locate yourself in this conversation?
Well, firstly, I definitely want to thank the opportunity. Also thank the space that I'm in with, I think, one of the most highly distinguished professors, academic intellectuals that I'm sharing the space with. It's definitely a great level of grace. So I want to start by saying that, I'm from the commerce field. So it's good that we finally have someone representing within the EMS that can actually comment on this. So we are represented when it comes to that. I come from that school of thought of industrial psychology and an economic framework and economic thought kind of thinking. And what you learn in commerce is kind of what you've just mentioned, that corporatism, that managerialism kind of skill, managing disruption, managing conflict, sustaining the status quo. I come from that school of thought. But I also come from a school of thought that is contradictory to that, which is a school of thought of activism that I have had the wonderful privilege from the ranks of being residence committees for 2 terms. One of those terms was at the height of the Moeniba uprising. The students would remember that kind of disruption and what it led to and what it meant for the campus community, particularly in us understanding that campuses have become highly militarized for some odd reason to sustain the status quo. And with that, I rose through the ranks of understanding politics through the South African Students' Congress in terms of ideological thinking, leftist thinking, before becoming SRC president. So how I come into this conversation is centered around those 2 things and I find myself in the intersection of those 2 things. Having that school of thought of knowing how to manage conflict, the corporatism, but also having a really great understanding and thinking of radicalist thought and activism. So I come into the conversation and as an activist, as an intellectual, in 3 ways. The first one is I understand myself through my leadership journey, which I've mentioned, where I've operated at the intersection of governance, student welfare, and ensuring that students at the core are well represented. But secondly, daily, I confront, not within a theoretical framework, but we are really the people that live raw the institutional systemic injustices that happen day in and day out, whether it be through the financial barriers that we face, whether it be through the academic exclusion, and whether it be victimization under the guise of order and peace. So that's where I come in as the SRC president. And the last thing where I come in is probably through a scratch that I've always wanted to itch. Now, I say this with the utmost respect. I think, in us trying to define the meaning of what it means to really resuscitate the agenda of the intellectual left, let's first understand where it really came from. It came at the height of oppression, particularly where coloureds were denied access to institutions of higher learning, and the University of the Western Cape came to be in existence, right, for coloureds as a space of access and learning. I do think, though, to a certain extent, we hold that phenomenon and that definition in very absolute terms, to a space where I think that we found ourselves in a very silent class and racial hierarchy now, where coloureds view themselves in a certain way compared to blacks in the University of the Western Cape. And you see this, and it actually mirrors the Group Areas Act in the classifications. There was whites, coloureds, and then blacks. You see it in us even rising in systemic injustice. Who are the first people to always disrupt the status quo? It's blacks. You see us in even protests. The majority is blacks, and if not, there is even no colored. So I find myself in that intersection currently as an SRC, not only as the SRC, but also a student activist in political formations beyond, where we're trying to make meaning and context and understanding and reconciliation that coloureds should not see themselves outside of being black. Because even Steve Biko defines the black definition as Indian coloureds and blacks. So that's where I think I come into this conversation and trying to challenge this social class, this racial hierarchy, this classism of note, where you have a certain residence that's been perceived as a residence for the high class. You see bursaries trying to fund this students, or rather bursaries fund these students, and these students live in those residences. Particularly, that's the residence you should live at, whereas you have your NSFAS students, lower class, middle students that live in another residence. For me, that's an analysis of society. And I love how people say universities are microcosms of society. And this is what we see also in this university. And we're trying so hard to eliminate this injustice, this classism that's happening. But here's the challenge in us doing that, particularly as leaders. SRC has a limited term. It has a limited term to the point where the way the system has been designed is that our fight now is no longer in the ground. It needs to be in boardrooms. It's in policy, it's in regulation, it's in practice, because that's where it's embedded itself. By the time that you're trying to change the status quo, your term is over. And I'm glad that the former acting SRC president is here, and I really want to commend him on the initiative he took around amending or redefining the student disciplinary rules. And it's unfortunate that he wasn't there long enough to see that go through. And by the time that you get in, you have the order and you have the mandate to be able to carry that forward. But are you able to make that meaningful transformation within a single term, or even 2 terms? So that's the new kind of thought. That's how we come into the conversation. And that's the new challenge that we face, I think, as student activists. In as much as they won't like to say it, probably the reason why we protest is because of quick wins. That's how we're going to be able to shake the status quo and be able to be heard. Had we been given the opportunity for actually challenging the systemic injustices in a framework and in a time period that allows us to be able to challenge them meaningfully, we would have done that. Yeah. That's where I think the new kind of conversation, the new kind of thought, probably leftist, probably also student activists and SRCs, political formation, that's where it should be centered to in trying to understand how we center ourselves into this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Mcntosh, also bringing the conversation to class and to racial identity. I think really important questions. Finally, I'd like to welcome Professor Moeniba Isaacs into the conversation. Moeniba is a professor at PLAS, as you've heard, where she leads research on food systems, land justice, and climate resilience. She also works across professional and community contexts in Africa. Moeniba, you work across spaces that are sometimes, I think, could be considered interdisciplinary in many ways. How do you locate yourself in this discussion personally and intellectually? What does the intellectual left mean to you? Oh, you need to switch it on.
It's on.
Can you hear?
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. Am I audible?
There we go.
Okay. So, come into this conversation as a student, of UWC, and coming in the late 80s, and there was a kind of nostalgia about, being in that moment, but also being in a moment where UWC became not only your political home, but also your my intellectual home. And during that time, there was a lot of, on edge movements towards, Hector. And we know that because just opposite the gate here at UWC were the apartheid operatives watching every move of the students during that time. So being at UWC is very emotional for me, but also deeply political. I have been wondering, coming in later years, the nostalgia of UWC, questioning what is left of the left at UWC. And I think this relates to both Craig's input and also Kelly's input and also Mcntosh input. And for me, I find myself that, I lean towards a lot of Donna Haraway's work and book on staying with trouble. So how do I locate myself into what already you see, what's left of the University of Western Cape, but also how do you then look at the realities and try to make change in the particular space that you're in? And I think it is important for us as research and where I locate myself to stay with the trouble. We need to stay with trouble. And how do we stay with the trouble? By forming part of the global debates that are out there around climate change, climate justice, climate movements, around nature and people, around how resurgence of conservation is dispossessing people of land and livelihoods, criminalizing people on a daily basis. For me, it's important to locate myself in that trouble, and through that, using a slow methodology of research. But I often question myself, who funds the work that we do? And I'm afraid not the universities. It's outside funders. And I think we have a responsibility moving forward into how do we fund trouble? How do we fund making trouble? And how do we fund solidarity movements? I have been tired of listening to the nostalgia about UWC is the home of the political left. I see Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences. I'm actually part of the faculty. So, and I see the deputy dean, the dean, acting dean is also here. So, I'm going to make a little bit of trouble there. And I'm going to ask, we have a school of government within our faculty. We have a school of finance. We have a school of entrepreneurship. Where at UWC Rector is the school of activism, a school where we make trouble, a school where we have solidarity. We cannot just talk about that. We need to move to kind of see how that translates into action. And for me, I want to kind of come into the conversation with that. And also, how do we transition? I have a lot of other more opinions on it, but I'm going to stop there to say, let's put that in our institutional plan. I see our executives here to kind of say, let's make trouble in a school of activism. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Moeniba. How do we fund trouble? This is so rich and so engaging, and I mean, I think we could have 2 whole days of conversation around it. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of that time. But I think what emerges from all the panelists is a rich sense of the pluralities and the tensions that shape the idea of a university, not just UWC, but a university of the left, what that looks like. I'm going to open up. I thought we'd have another round of questions for the panelists, but I don't think we have time for that here. I want to hear from the audience. I'd like to open up to you for comments, questions. I'm going to take 3 at a time. We are running over time at the moment, but we're going to go right until 11:30. So you have about 25 minutes for good conversation. We're going to take 3 at a time. I'll ask you to introduce yourself. I see lots of hands. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself when the mic comes. Again, keep it as a comment or a question. This is not conference proceedings. You're just a question and a comment. So I'm going to take one on the left. I'm choosing. I saw people in the front first here, so I'm going to take Sibolelo. So 1, 2, and then 1 on that side again. So left, right, left. Here first, and then I'll come back to the other rounds. Thank you. Thank you. Introduce yourself and then go. Can you hear? We need your mic to be on. Okay, I think you can go.
Doc from Political Studies. An intellectual home of the
Okay, thank you. For those of you who didn't hear that because the mic wasn't working, it's Keith who was here in the 1980s when these conversations were happening, and his question or comment is that the best, say it, autocracy is terrible for university. We have to be collegial. Okay, Sibolelo.
Thank you, Prof. Good morning, colleagues. Sibulelo Makapela, African Language Studies Department in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. Thank you for this platform. It is long overdue, but not too late. When I joined UWC, I joined straight from government parliament. I've been here for 8 years. I had other offers, but for some reason, I was drawn to UWC based on the teachings of Jake Harbe. We had as political schools and in parliament for staff members.
Question.
Yes, I'm getting there. But he also warned the universities in terms of commercializing the universities. And unfortunately, in my experiences at UWC, I've seen quite a lot of that commercialization to a point where we are stifled in proceeding with our research, which some of us has to do with community involvement. And we find that you are given invoices that are exorbitant, ridiculously exorbitant. You don't know where you'll get that. And also the question of religion. Nothing was ever mentioned to me that this is a Muslim university. But in everything that I've been doing, you find that that element comes in, that everything has to align to that religion. I think those are some of the issues that needs to be addressed, needs to be unpacked, so that moving forward, we avoid unnecessary conflict between other stakeholders within the institution. I have a lot, but I will stop with that.
Thank you, Sibolelo. Okay, and there's a question. Sorry. No, I'm sure we can because we want people who are online to be able to hear you. I'm sure IA can figure this out. So we need the recording.
1, 2.
Hey, you're fighting. Thank you. My name is Takalani Makita. I am a PhD candidate at this university, and I also serve in the SRC as the postgraduate liaison officer. I have a few comments, but I'll keep it short.
Thank you.
I think the rhetoric of the University of the Left, I think, is such a platform where we have to decide and be truthful with ourselves that are we continuing with the rhetoric, because we continue with the rhetoric but we are doing nothing in terms of applying the practicalities around the rhetoric. Few years ago, if not three, the university received the MasterCard Foundation Scholarship. In applying that foundation scholarship, the university decided that for residence purposes, we're going to take these students to a privately owned resident. One, maybe because it is some sort of class that is applied to it, which is COVEX, and avoid bringing the very same students into our residence community. We still exist in a university where student protests, and the first thing that comes out of lecturers' mouth is that hooligans disturbed classes. We are not hooligans. We are fighting for the right cause. Last one. If we are deciding today that we are continuing with the rhetoric, it is also today where we also have to decide where do we start and where do we benchmark. For example, every year in this university, there is a registration crisis. In the university next door, they've already implemented a system that is practical. They are saying that registration is not free. However, it is billed on the student account, but it is not a requirement at the beginning of the year in order to ensure that the academic year starts soon for everyone who has passed. Then those who have not proceeded, then they have to pay registration fee. We have to have a leftist approach in thinking, and we have to be very much student-centric. So we cannot be making decisions about how students think should go without the inclusion of students. If conversations are being had that speaks directly to student experience, but nothing speaks directly to the inclusion of all these students, we have started failing. That is my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm hearing that there are, at least in the latter two questions, there are questions about how if we say we want to revitalize the university as the university of the left, how do those values align with our very practical outworkings in the university, whether that's invoices or how we make bookings or how we register students, etc. But those are very practical concerns that I think, and operational concerns that I think will feed into the processes of the IOP and other matters. I'm not sure that our panelists here could necessarily answer some of those questions. So if they would allow, would you allow me to take a few more? Because I want to come to the discursive matters of what does it mean to be the intellectual home of the left. And I saw the Trinity here. I think this is an unholy Trinity up front, but I'm going to go with the three of you because I did see the three of your hands first, and then I'm seeing other hands, and I'm noting 1, 2, 3. We'll do that in the next round. Okay, so the three up front here. Thank you. Right here.
Thank you, and thank you to my colleagues for allowing Age Before Beauty. This is a really important.
Say who you are. Introduce yourself.
I'm Heidi Grineboom from the Center for Humanities Research and a doctoral graduate of UWC. Quickly, I came here in 1998, also looking for the left that I'd heard about to study with intellect and also didn't find them. It took me many years, I don't know now, it's 30, 40 years later, to understand that when Jakes left for first a democratic government, so did something like 25% of UWC's professoriate. So, that marks our institution. But I'd also like to make a comment about UWC's foundation because it's an excellent example of the problem of apartheid and what it did to institutions. And so I would like to challenge you a little to say that it wasn't established as an apartheid university under the ironically named extension of University to allow access to so-called colored students, but to produce administrators for apartheid. It was to advance a divide and rule strategy. And it was one of the reasons I came here was precisely because there was a concept, a critical concept of the problem of race, in which blackness was perhaps pointing to a way out of our predicament, rather than adopting a concept blackness that was apartheid's concept, which was a divide and rule concept, and which has just kind of re-emerged out of the institutional archaeology over the arc of the century to almost like two tectonic plates. There's the very conservative ethno-nationalist kind of foundation of diversity at UWC, and then there's the discursive and political claims and that emerged from the 1980s. So just to put that there, and also to I'm really interested in holding and the tension that's emerging between the macro concept of the left, which clearly needs to be reinvented together for the world as much as for ourselves institutionally and our society, alongside of the more kind of micro practical workings out of what that means to really live together and to make the possibilities for flourishing life in our institution which already exist.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Haiti.
No, thanks, Prof. Nadar. My name is Siabonga Skudla, final year law student, who so happens to have been the acting president of the SRC last year. When it comes to this particular topic that we are gathered about here, you know, I've always wanted to view UWC being the intellectual home of the left, not just being a UWC movement, but being a movement that will spread across the entire higher education space. But before we even go forward to spreading this particular movement that we want to revitalize here, I think it's very important for us to first and foremost define what this means for us, an intellectual home of the left. What is the left? What is the ideological meaning surrounding the left? And you know, there's a certain difficulty and discomfort that comes with identifying with this ideological meaning, especially for those who come from liberal and neoliberal backgrounds. And if we want to be viewed as this intellectual home of the left, then one must safely assume that this must be a place where people who identify with this particular meaning must find this particular home a safe home. And we have not been seeing that for a number of years. We've even lost academics because of this. And you know, we must be able to dare to ask the question of, or to dare to ask questions surrounding the injustices of the world, the injustices that our people are suffering in this country. But we mustn't just ask those questions and then forget about what is happening here. And that is a very important thing that we regularly do, you know. Not to say that the issues surrounding us are less important. What is happening in Iran is very important. What is happening in Hungary at this very moment, where the LGBTQIA plus community is denied of their right of freedom of assembly, is very important. But what is also important is for us to address the injustices that are happening on campus.
Thank you.
Because there are injustices. And it's very sad. You know, it's very sad. You know, when I came in here, I thought I was going to see and I'm concluding, Prof.
I'm waiting.
It's very sad to see that the protagonists of the neoliberal institutional culture that we've been diving into over the years are not here. It's very sad to see that they're not here, because these are the people that actually need to hear what we are saying here. These are the people who are supposed to somewhat repent their ways, because at this very moment we are preaching to the repentant. But no, so that's just the comment I wanted to make. Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
Mr. Sagudla. Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tiro Ramasodi. I am a student in the Faculty of Arts, and also I am the former Deputy Chairperson of SASCO here in UWC, and I'm the current spokesperson of the Young Communist League. So, I have not heard anyone yet speak about the issue of land first and foremost.
Land.
Yes.
Yes.
Because Prof spoke about the conservation of the land, but yet we are not given any autonomy or any updates about how people are going to decide to use their land. Are we going to look at it from a communist or socialist lens, or are we going to look at it from a neoliberal lens, which has caused us so many problems? If people are interested in the issues of land, they will know about the citrus farms that were burned in Limpopo because people were not able to facilitate communication. So now when we look at our own nature reserve that we have and the Anthropocene that we see all around us, how do we go and facilitate those communications and the discourse around the issue of land in Cape Town? And not just that, how does the school equip and emancipate the mind of the students to go and to be able to fight on their own? Because the thing is, we have heard voices being maimed and voices being silenced. We see it in CPS and pro events going after students when they go and protest and voice out their issues. Students are being silenced and are being harassed by these institutions. So what is the university going to do in regards to those things? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow, a whole range of interesting comments and questions. I'm not going to try and summarize. I'm just going to ask you to jump in wherever you can. I see, Kelly, you are ready to go. Are you ready to
Always.
go? So go.
So I just want to say that when what we're told, we didn't have a time for a second round of comments, but I think what's absolutely central to posing the question of what it means to revive the left at a university is that we have to be fundamentally committed not to the project of assimilating students into the world as it is. We have to be fundamentally committed to the deep transformation of the world. That's at the heart of the project. And so if we are fundamentally committed not just to a superficial flag democratic transformation of the world, but a deep transformation, the kind that we were denied in this country, that we have not achieved in any measure, inequality is growing. We have to ask the question, what is the university's responsibility to that project of deep transformation? And we have to ask that in every research proposal. We have to ask that in every student supervision. We have to ask that in every course outline that we make. How am I taking responsibility for the development of ideas and orientations that can radically transform the society that we live in? That seems foundational to me. But the big question is how you do that. Because the method matters enormously. It really matters enormously. And the kinds of relationships that you forge in asking that question at every turning point is hugely significant. And my mentors always taught me, if you're a member of a Communist Party and you go and knock on someone's door, you don't take them a flyer of the history of Trotskyism and try and sell them a Spartacist project. You ask them, what are your problems and how can we work on them together? So I think as an orientation for academics to take on the most serious questions of what are your problems and to build connections with movements, with communities that are the most affected by the violence of the society, and have that as a foundational orientation to in every faculty. Right? This seems to me to have to be at the heart of our project.
Thanks, Kelly. Thank you. I think what's interesting about what you're saying is, speaking about being left as an orientation, it comes back to that phrasing and what we spoke about at the beginning. Is it about being an intellectual home of the left or the home of the intellectual left? Because that's two different things. If you think about UWC as an intellectual home of the left, then that's about UWC identity. Whereas if it's the home of the intellectual left, it's a space that perhaps tolerates leftism, perhaps welcomes it, in the best sense, but it may not be an identity that the university seeks to to hold. And what I hear you saying is it has to be an identity. It has to be an orientation if we're going to do it, that the whole university moves forward, and that's what makes us unique as UWC. Am I hearing that? I see Crain nodding. Anyone want to come in on that? Sure, Mcntosh. Unmute yourself. I think we can hear you. Yeah.
I definitely agree that it must be an identity that we resonate with, because when we understood that kind of meaning, that ideology, we didn't understand it in very relative terms. We understood in a very absolute term that what it means to be a university of the intellectual left. Here's my thoughts on this. I have two proposals I think that are very important and critical. The first one is that students have never lost the identity, especially student leaders and activists. We've never lost the identity of what it means to be left. We challenge it constantly, daily, in statutory committees and council. We challenge it daily in our residences. We challenge it as a practice too. We live and we breathe it raw. I think the problem, or rather, let me rephrase it. I think where we seem to lose it is through the role that academics have in being able to cultivate. I want to say that collaboration does not mean conformity. It does not mean that. In fact, our solidarity must be rooted in a term of intellectual exchange, not politeness. And I think we've disguised the consciousness of activism through being polite, through being diplomatic. But that's not the sense of why an academic institution even exists. It's to challenge the status quo, it's to challenge the ideas, it's to challenge the very system and why it was designed and how it was designed. So I think that academics in this project really have a huge role to play, and I think professors, particularly doctors, they should support student-led dissent. They should support it at every means necessary, because you're capacitating and you're building not only an academic, but you're building a member of society that can be able to change it. And not just people, professors should not be people that just distance themselves under the pretext of what I call neutrality. Yeah. The last thing is that academics should be our activist allies. They really should be our activist allies. They should just not be around the borders of teaching the content, the curriculum, but they should also support us. They should be people who we are able to lobby when the system is unjust to us. So I think that's a very important consideration in the role that we have as student leaders with academics, because the moment that relationship is fragmented and there's a disjuncture, that's why you always see an us versus them situation. Yeah. Because in the first place, they didn't support and they don't understand our frustrations.
Thank you. Thanks, Mcntosh. In the few minutes that we have left, I'm going to ask Crain and Moeniba to bring us to a close on this discussion. We will, after this, I know we had other questions, but we're not going to have time, but we will, after this, take a short break, and then we'll come back with the respondent panel. And those of you who had questions from this session can also feed that back into the next session. But Crain and then Moeniba. Can you hear? Can you hear? Otherwise, we could do it with the roving mic as well. Both of them aren't working. Maybe a roving mic. Oh, there we go.
That's working. So I think a question which we should leave here relatively well answered has to be this question: is what we mean by the left. So it's really important that for the value just of the pedagogical value of this occasion that is understood. And it's at the outset, I want to say to you, it really is important. And this is what this debate was between Neville, Alexander, and Jakes. By the way, it wasn't a live debate. It was all on paper. And that's often how these things...
Where can we find those debates, Crain, for those who want to read more?
I don't know. People have written about it. I've written about it. You know, Primesh has written about it, and so on. There's also, just for also information, a really important debate which Ruth First had with Archie Mafeje. Really wonderful. It's all on paper. But the key thing about all of this is to say that as people in a university space, it's absolutely important not to be dogmatic, doctrinaire, kind of fundamentalist about these things. Not to be essentialist. So I'm a sociologist. Don't be essentialist. Don't be reductionist. You know, don't think in terms of last causes and so on. It really is important to be open-minded about this, because I want to say what it means to be left right now is very open for discussion.
Yeah.
It's not straightforward at all. There are ontological things about it. There are practical things about it. You know, there are relational things about, and all of these things must be the subjects of discussion. And you need to have that discussion. And it's really the most important site I want to say to you where this is going to happen is in the classroom. And that's not just an ideological, it's a space for exploring what the limits of our possibilities are in terms of the current ways in which we are able to understand dignity, the recognition of difference, the right of people to the fullest well-being that is possible in all of our spaces, and to explore how that is. I mean, particularly, I want to say, Mark, in commerce, in these, you know, because the dominance of the big hegemon now is almost complete. Almost complete. You have intense difficulty in thinking and framing a world for yourself outside of these ideas of winning and losing, deal making, the idea of me, this incredible individualism, and fundamentally racialization. You know, the way racialization, and so understanding UWC as a space in which this project of racialization is worked with critically and then not critically and then embraced and so on is really, really important. These are all of the engine rooms of what this dominance is all about. And you've got to find ways pedagogically, every classroom, and I'm going to talk about physics in particular. You know, physics is such wonderful stuff. And you've got to think about how you situate the stuff of physics and not think of it as this gift of people like Einstein and Niels Bohr to the world, these white men from these northern parts of the world, you know, but it's a gift of the whole provenance of the last 5,000 years. Niels Bohr is an inheritor of the last 5,000 years. He is not the epitomization of white supremacy, you know, and the way in which that kind of thinking comes to be landed, you know, in our midst. And so it really is crucial that that encounter in the classroom now should be thought about moving boundaries every single time the opportunity arises.
Thank you so much, Crain and Moeniba. Closing thoughts.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, I think you are.
No?
Maybe just use the mic.
Hello?
Yes, there we go.
Yeah, I think for me it's not just the responsibility to kind of who is left and where is the left at UWC, it is the responsibility of all faculties. I think it's not just the responsibility of arts, humanities, social sciences. And I think we need to kind of extend that dialogue into science and technology, financialization subjects that we have. How do we integrate where UWC have moved towards social justice? Are we just saying that social justice is what we work on and we have to integrate in our work? Or are we saying that all of us need to commit to the social justice project of UWC? And I think there's of this coming out in different ways at UWC, but I think it is not a collective. And it's not collective within the faculty. There is this transition that I have been working interdisciplinary with sciences, that when it comes to politics, when it comes to issues about justice, when it comes to decision making, deeply political decisions that they are forming part of, provide information, data to, but they say we're neutral. Yeah. And I think it is important that they need to be part of the discussion. I want to end with something. The Freedom Flotilla Madeleine is referred in the Freedom Flotilla to Gaza, was a group of activists and also someone quite known, Greta Thunberg. But the Madeleine is named after the only fisherwoman in Gaza. And that is the work that I'm doing in my research. And I think it is important that when we're talking about social justice movements, we are also looking at solidarity towards not only housing, land issues, natural resources. We also need to look at how do we build solidarity across movements. And I think it is important that we connect all of that, not just our own issues, not just in Sudan, but also Gaza. How do we connect all of that to our work? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Colleagues, it's impossible to deal with all the questions. There's so much unfinished here, the land, the left, lines of solidarity. I think there's a lot more to pick up, and we'll try to, as much as possible, pick that up in the next round with our next panel. But for now, I'd like to thank our panelists. Thank you each for the ways in which you've contributed to this conversation, for how you've held the space with complexity and care. Really, we have so much appreciation for that, and we'll thank you more a little bit later. But thanks to you and thanks to our audience. I'm not sure that QR thing actually worked. We'll see if we can get it working. It did? You could see questions? Okay, I couldn't see them, so but I'm glad it worked, and then I'm glad that you were able to see some of those questions. So we'll take a break now. It's 11:40. There's coffee and there's brown bags with some goodies in them. Please help yourselves. And we will be at 12 o'clock for our next session. Thank you, everyone. Goodies. Sorry, struggling. A little bit nasal.
1, 2.
Where's the mic? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. One,
One, one, one, one, two. Testing 1, 2. One, 1, 2. Two, 1, 2.
Two, two, 1, 2. 2, 2, 1.
1, 2. This is L9. One, two, 1, 2, D3, working. 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, to lapel. 2, 1, 2. One, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 1, 2. Yo, very loud. Drop this one. 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, one, that one. No, there. 1, 2.
Okay, I think we are ready to begin our next panel. Thank you, everyone, for staying the course. Thank you to our first panel for those rich and engaging discussions. It's clear that we have much more to discuss, which is why we have a second panel. And so we turn now to that, to the second half of our program. And we've called this a respondent panel. But the idea of the response is not just to summarize what has happened in the first session, but to stretch. This panel is about listening. It's about listening carefully to the first conversation, but also I think in terms of our panelists have been briefed that they've taken in the provocations, the silences, the openings, and this is their space to reflect, to challenge, to deepen the conversation. So that's what they're here to do. So I'd like to, we'll follow the same format. I was going to introduce everyone, ask them to locate themselves in the conversation, and then take a second round of questions. But we found that didn't quite work. So I'm going to ask them to locate themselves in the conversation, and also at the same time to respond to a particular idea or a provocation from the earlier discussion, something that you might have heard from the audience or the panelists, and to extend that and take that further. And so it's my privilege to introduce you to our first panelist.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation to this discussion. It really is a remarkable thing. It may be modest, but that doesn't mean it's not remarkable. We all know that the idea of the university at its most creative, at its most critical, at its most welcoming to dissent and staying with problems, has been under a long and sometimes slow, sometimes quick attack, really going back to the beginning of the neoliberal period. That's now in many parts of the world rapidly escalating to the point in Gaza of just absolute destruction. Yeah. But even if you look at what's happened at Columbia in New York, the speed with which the university folded in the face of Donald Trump's threats, I don't think there can be many universities, and certainly very, very few, if any, outside of the few places in the world where there are progressive governments, mostly in Latin America, where this kind of conversation could happen, not just with the sanction of the people who've been entrusted with leadership, but with the absolute support. It's a remarkable thing that needs to be... It needs to be treated with care and looked after and given an understanding of its full value. There's so much that came up in the first discussion. You've asked the panelists to say how they locate themselves. I don't generally speak about myself, but as a direct request. But you also talked about listening. Now, I don't think the question of what is the left should have a definitive answer at all. I think it should always be open-ended, should always be a discussion. I mean, within parameters, of course. And nobody has all the answers. And even the most well-developed answers are answers to a part of what that means. So it shouldn't be finished. And for a project like this, it needs to be, as people remarked this morning, as capacious, as welcoming, as generous as is possible. There's a difference between entering conversations to end them and assert your dominance, and entering conversations to contribute with humility to the process of enriching them. But I was very struck by the fact that you started this panel with the idea of listening, because there are a variety of hugely important ways to be left. I mean, maybe it is being a scientist doing certain kind of studies. And, not everyone has to be in or proximate to a movement. I mean, if people are working on ways of us getting technical autonomy from funding from the US state to protect our public healthcare system, that is absolutely valuable. We don't all have to do the same work. But for me, the intellectual ideas I've been most gripped by and the kind of work that has happened in the course of my life, of course, to be left, one thing that it does mean unequivocally is to be committed in an axiomatic way to equality, and equality as a universal value. What that means is debatable and so on. But for me, if the left in the university is going to have productive relationships with people in struggle outside of the university, it's this thing that is fundamental. It's listening. It's radical listening. Without that, I personally don't feel those kinds of relations are likely to be politically productive. And there's a wonderful line in Frantz Fanon that, I mean, he's just so good at one-liners, but he's talking about university-trained intellectuals who have been forced out of the university, and we must keep in mind that there's often a price to be paid for sticking with certain problems. You know, no matter how one does it, you do at a certain point run into resistance. But this wonderful line he's got is he's talking about the engagement, the encounter, he calls it, between university-trained intellectuals and oppressed people who, in the context he's writing about, in the sort of immediate moment of post-colonial betrayal, are beginning to go back to struggle. And he affirms what he calls a mutual current of enlightenment and enrichment. So that would be my answer to your question about where I would situate, how I would start to engage this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. Radical listening. Yeah. On that note, we'll go to our next panelist, Dr. Fikile Vilakazi Alberts, who's the director of the Gender Equity Unit here at UWC. She's a social scientist, a lifelong activist, and Fikile, you bring together scholarship, activism, spirit work, and a feminist politics into your work. How do you personally and politically and professionally locate yourself in this debate, and what have you heard from this morning?
Thank you very much. I actually, entered the conversation from just having been a UWC student in the 90s, and a political activist as well, situated within UWC as South Africa, transitions into democracy from apartheid. So my conversation and my positionality comes from that place where I can literally feel the vibe at UWC at that time. I think the point of reference being the Das capital, the strong Marxist revolutionary spirit that was waving within the institution. So I move within that space as a student, as a thinker, as an activist, also really disturbed by the politics of apartheid. And I think it's important to remember that, because it helps us to ask a question that says, have we transitioned? Because I entered from that place of joining a movement that says transitioning into something from elsewhere, apartheid colonialism. So UWC becomes that place where I enter with that body politic that is firmly grounded in everything that the institution did. When I was a student, for instance, in residences, I also was a student leader at that time in residences, but also within the SFC at some point, you find that it was so easy. We did have our difficulties, but we're within an institution that was grounded in the doing of the left, that we did not have to, for instance, worry how we're going to make food in residences. We had dining halls. We had clinics here on campus that you could easily go to and have access to services without having to pay, for instance. Things that have radically shifted within the institution, where students have to have medical aids and students have to cook for themselves. And I'm making these practical examples because for me, that is what fundamentally it means to be left. What it means to be left is really centered in the ideas of the, at that time, from the Das Kapital, the rising of the proletariat, of the worker. I think in the spirit of South Africa, the rising of the oppressed into a space of governance, into a space of leading. But I want to say that I'm coming into conversation also with a lot of questions, because what our understanding of the left has given us at the time was the spirit of protest, right? Because we were protesting a particular system that was oppressive, apartheid colonialism. So it became a tool of resistance, which manifested itself in the form of protest, protesting against an oppressive system. And then the questions that I'm bringing after 30 years of that work located in this institution, and having listened to the panel earlier on in the morning, before we came in, is that all what the left is giving us to resist systems of oppression? So that's the question that I'm asking us. And I think as we go into the new arrangement as a university, it's a question that we need to ask. And then the second question that we need to ask, is it possible that there's something in the left that we have not explored over time, which is not just protest? Protest is a part of it, which is not just resisting in certain ways, but looking, for instance, at how does the left govern? And I think these are questions that are not just facing UWC, but generally, the apartheid leadership in the country, where we all emerged from exile, and I'm including we here deliberately, even though you didn't go to the forest. Many of us fought apartheid on the pavements of society, being exiled by the apartheid colonial system. And then we emerge, and this is very, very parallel to the time when the School of Government was started at UWC. I was here when that transition happened, with an understanding that we will take that politic of Marxism, Das Kapital, leftist conversations into spaces of governance. So the School of Government is formed with an understanding that our scholarship will take us into that place, which means then that we arrange our content in a certain way. We arrange our curriculum in a certain way. And the understanding is that it will also take us into some form of leadership, right? We are talking here, when I was at UWC at that time, the rector was Professor Khasembe. So and I think one of the speakers articulated that conversation and that debate between Jakes Khasembe and Nigel. Neville, sorry. Thank you so much for that, in Neville. So it brings us into the question of leading. When we are imagining or reimagining the left, we have to answer questions about how do we lead from the left? And it's a question of also then implementation. But I also bring in the 5 Ps, right? The 5 elements that I think are very, very fundamental to an institutional operational plan, which is that work of protesting. Is there still something fundamentally needing us to protest against? That's a very critical question. And how does that work of protesting looks like? For instance, when many of us are living in an era that is thought as post-apartheid or post-colonial, are we continuing to protest the post-colonial and the post-apartheid in ourselves, amongst ourselves, or against a system? Have we become a part of that system? What elements of the apartheid and the colonial have internalized amongst ourselves, just in the manner that we have arranged the university? And I think that's happening within the body university that is completely and deeply neoliberal. And then there's the people. There's an element of the people. The people were different in 1993 when I was a first year student here at UWC, in that we had in South Africa a social contract that united the majority of South Africans under the United Democratic Front
where I think the fragmentations that we're experiencing today of the left were not so clear then. Going from the ANC in exile and coming into the Pan-Africanist Congress, for instance, Inkatha Freedom Party, but into UDF, which did a lot of work in the country at that time. It's very important to remember that because UWC occurs within that body politic, where the colored question comes into effect. I think one of the speakers mentioned the colored question into why then UWC was even, opened when we called it Bush at that time. That language is even disappearing. There's a symbolism and the meaning of why that is. So anyway, it happening in terms of the people. UDF brings all of us into this resistance politic that says we are all black. And this is coming from Steve Biko's work after he is murdered in 1976, or just after that, around black consciousness. Right? What does it mean to be black in the context of South Africa? And everybody embraces this, that says we are all, anything that is non-white is black, because we need to dismantle the system that is apartheid. So UWC body politic is really deeply embedded in that. But Karl Marx is a center of it. I mean, Das Kapital, you could find it, you could find it at the student center. I could walk into the student center. The student center was a vibrant space of dialogue, right? So the people are dialogical. The people at UWC are in constant conversation with each other. And I'm talking about the people here being students, being staff members. You could go to the student center and lunchtime discussions, a cleaner is there, a lecturer is there, a student is there, the SRC is there, so the security is there. So all of us are in constant conversation as the people around the arrangements of that which we need to be. So it's very important, and I think we're deeply embedded in this idea of the proletariat, the rising of the worker, the rising of the oppressed, into a certain level. So I think the things that, when I look back in retrospect, Chair, is that I don't think as Africa we imagined the left taking the people to govern. Although we do have that, I think, in the Freedom Charter that says the people shall govern, right? Governing from the left, do you continue to govern from a place of resistance, or do you continue to govern from a place of leadership? What does it mean to govern? Governance, I think the SFC president spoke about coming from that corporate managerial aspects of leading in intersectionality with being activist. So what is then asking us is, in response to the panel in the morning, is that we need to think about the leftist not just as pavement politics, but the politics of governance. It's very, very important in how we source money, the kinds of associations we make with donors, the kinds of friends that we make in the international community, the kinds of students that we recruit, the kind of scholarship that we take into our classrooms, the kind of people that we recruit into being workers at UWC have got to be firmly embedded into this identity that we are. So we need to be proud of the identity of being ideological left, or being the home of the ideological left. So the standpoint is key.
Ask you to
yes,
to round it up. Yeah,
not a problem. So I mean, there's so much that I can say, but I think for me, I come into this conversation from that deep place of being grounded in the left, and my argument is that the left has shifted, but I'm happy to come back into articulating how I see that. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you so much to think through here. Thank you also for taking us back to the history a little bit. I think Crain was keen on us going back to the conversation of what it was, so that we can also think about where we're going, and also thinking about the left beyond protest. I think that's an important point that we should pick up just now. And I apologize for my croaky throat. I'm still recovering a bit from a cold. Professor Rajendra Chetty, our third respondent, is a scholar of language education in the Faculty of Education here at UWC. Also, he works across post-colonial critique, literacy in high poverty communities, and decolonial research methodologies. Rajendra, your work moves between the classroom, the community, and the curriculum. How do you locate yourself in this particular conversation?
Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. I think that I locate myself within both the intellectual, but it cannot be separated from the political. And for me, an important aspect of a university of the left is what I would call a critical humanism. I think that when that whole idea came up with, I was not here, so I don't have a so-called romantic history. I think it was a very revolutionary humanism that came up then. And you know, I'm now softening it and saying we need a critical humanism. I think that we've become so immune to a society that has dehumanized their people that we are silent. More importantly, universities, not only UWC, universities reward our silence.
Yeah.
Our silence has given cops, whether it's Marikana, Izidumeni, January this year was Stilfontein, US. That critical humanism has been eroded.
Sorry. Your mic is your neck. If you could maybe just hold it.
Yeah. So what is the role of the intellectual in that? And I think when you look at the social cartography of us as intellectuals, all, you know, lecturers, etc., too many of us are traditionalists. Too many of us are conservative. And then we got the creep of the moderates. They will write about decolonization. They will do the university's transformation agenda. They're the most dangerous people.
Yeah.
Because you just cannot only philosophize and talk. Where is the action? And if you look at the subaltern struggle, especially in Cape Town, you know, during COVID, we had 18 evictions of communities. I mean, it was COVID, and you had 18 evictions by this provincial government. There was total silence. And, you know, where is our engagement with the high levels of the killing of children? We seem to become so immune to it, and we forget that we kill 900 children a year, an average, just quite high. And at every level, I worry about how the system, the governance of universities, the stifling bureaucracy, the kind of foregrounding so strongly of the administrative. There are more technicians, more admin people, how they reward you if your paperwork is right, how they love you to write reports, how nobody reads those reports, how we constantly play the game. And how, for me, coming from teaching and learning, how we've allowed that dichotomy between research and teaching to such an extent. Teaching, the foundation of the university, is on the margins, because there is the critical voice of the student. There is critical thinking, but we play these silly games and we look at, say, graduate attributes because we want them to get work. And what we are doing is that we are playing into that profit-driven corporate university. I think that to become the university of the left, the first step is a deep reflection and on how we're reinforcing all the wrong things that a university should be. And the most important is the voice. We need to regain our voice. We went silent post 1994, thinking it's allegiance. To such an extent now, our silence is giving such consent to the dehumanization of the subaltern. And it is reaching proportions which are quite frightening. And how we become immune to that because we are caught up in the silence. And those few that do talk, how the universities, our faculties, our colleagues are so suspicious of them. And yet, we all should be, within this context, we all should have that element where people look at us with suspicion. But it's so easy to target those that are not swimming with the tide of the neoliberal university.
Thank you, Rajendra. Wow. Lots of affirmation, thinking about the silent and the silenced, perhaps, president, and a scholar whose work interrogates hegemonic continuity from apartheid through to fees must fall. Lindokuhle, your intellectual formation, I think, at UWC, both in its student movements, but also now in its critical traditions, offers you a unique space to reflect on this question. Where do you locate yourself in this?
Thank you.
Yeah,
Can you hear?
maybe a bit louder.
Silence me,
There we go. No such thing as the voiceless. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the introduction and also being part of the panel. I think the gift and the curse of being the last speaker is that colleagues have raised all the critical points that are there, but also the benefit is that, there's a lot to take from those to be able to stretch our thinking a bit further. Just to take on the last point that Prof. Rajendra mentioned around the stifling of intellectual energy, the exuberance of, a first-year student who disagrees with the lecturer, not necessarily knowing much about the subject, but just not being convinced or persuaded by an academic standing in front of them, and us shutting down that exuberance by saying, you know nothing, you have to listen and you have to do all of those things. And I think a big part of, the biggest thing at stake here is to be able to understand what do we mean by the left in that sense. And I think in practice, it's those things of saying the transgression of boundaries is something that we're open to all the time, right? The idea that dissent is not seen as opportunity at the University of the Western Cape or any other university for that matter is in and of itself a problem, because dissent is an opportunity for us to be better. Dissent is an opportunity for us to transform. And where I locate myself in this particular conversation is that, despite what the unregulated beard might suggest, I'm 33 years old. And I do not come from, that rich history that Dr. Vilakazi Alberts mentioned around where UWC was. But I think I am a product of firstly, the first thing is to be honest and say that the university, as envisioned by Prof. Jakes at that time, has shifted radically towards the other alternative. The university we sit in, I do not mean to say that we are romantically, no, the University of the Western Cape is no longer the intellectual home of the left. So the first thing is to say the bravery to have this conversation from someone who comes in to the university and not to downplay the idea that Professor Robert Balfour comes in where the university had a lot of the tenuous and a tension and a relationship between itself and its constituents in terms of getting a new vice chancellor. That process wasn't easy. But then that particular vice chancellor comes into the university and, starts trouble and has a dialogue like this. Normally, what we do is that we say, this is what should be done. We can't, applaud a fish for swimming. But the fish hasn't been swimming here for 2 decades. So now we get a fish, they want to swim, we want to swim with them. So we must applaud that bravery, that courageousness of saying, let's start this conversation. And then, of course, I come from this particular, and I'm not saying that the university is progressive in anything. I'm saying I come from that resistance. I come from a particular tradition of people who have been resisting that move to the other side. I come from a place where my education at the University of the Western Cape, which I think is a world-class education, but in certain corridors, it's a world-class education. It is a world-class education outside of the classroom. It is a world-class education in the context of the relationships that we build inside here and both outside. So I come from that resistance of this idea that the university must be corporatist, must be managerial. And I come from a particular place where I was taught Karl Marx without hiding. Because this is what we do. If you ask an economic student now, do you meet Karl Heinrich Marx in your curriculum? And they might largely tell you probably 10%, if at all, explained. And that is an indictment intellectually on anyone who wants to train an economist. You do not want to think about the most critical person who's thought about this mode of production, and you call that an effective education. Now, I come from a place where, ironically, we are in the economic and management sciences faculty. It's very ironic. I won't explain it now. Next door to us is the accounting department. And myself and Dr. Hoskins, we always, when the accounting students always go collect their scripts, there's a lot of them. And we ask them, maybe facetiously, what is the philosophy of accounting? And they go, no, what do you mean? There's no philosophy in accounting. But basically what we're really asking them is, do they know what is the origins of this discipline that is accounting? What is the social function of accounting? Is accounting just a thing about debits and credits, or is accounting something that is particularly protecting the logic and the interests of wealth creators globally, and that is capital across the world? But you will not get taught this as an accounting student. And I come from that particular tradition that says, why are we not being taught this? All right. And so my thing is to say that there's always been hope for this place. And I am a representation of that hope. I come from a place where I did my PhD and I was a fellow at the Center for Humanities Research, where there was a critical question asked, what is the university in Africa for? That question, typical of that space, is still not fundamentally answered. But that question stands. What are we trying to do with the university in this most downtrodden continent in the world? What is the place of this particular university? So I come from this tradition and I locate myself in this place from a place of being allowed as a petulant child to ask the questions that parents don't want to answer. And I think that is the energy that I want to bring to the space, but also that is the energy I want to say to people. Let's harness that energy. And then finally, the idea that I picked up here that Prof. Crain mentioned around the classroom being the most fundamental part of the university. I see the classroom as a site of struggle myself. And I see the idea that giving students who have been for 18 years indoctrinated in most largely what it means to be a human being is to me. I've got to pull myself up by my bootstraps. I've got to be, what's my side hustle? I've got to, I've got to make money. Success to me means I've got to resemble Dr. Patrice Motsepe and have all the wealth in the world. It does not mean to me to be a socially valuable person who can contribute to the society in a way that improves the lives of those around me. Now, in the classroom, we have an opportunity to take those 18 years and push against them and say, students, why do you think it's correct for you to believe that you should be rich and the next person should be poor? Why do you believe that your wealth, fundamentally, by scientific logic, will emanate from the exploitation of other people? And if the classroom is seen as an opportunity, other people call it decolonial. I have problems with the term myself. But I call this a very revolutionary ideal. This ideal of saying, let's push back against this society, because all of us sitting here agree this is not the best advert of humanity, the society. We need a new world. We need to make a new world, but we can't make a new world if we do not sufficiently explain what is wrong with the current world. And that's why the classroom I see as a site of struggle, and we can't have that particular kind of classroom if we don't have the ethos of what it means to be left, to see dissent as this wonderful opportunity, as this illuminating possibility to say, if students disagree, there's nothing wrong. Professor Brian O'Connell, I always make this. He used to roll up his sleeves. When I was a student activist, I caused a lot of problems at this place. When I was a student activist, he used to come and say, no, you guys are correct. Talk to me. What is the issue? And he'd ask you. At times you think, hey, we didn't think clearly about this issue enough. And that's part of what it was under his leadership, to say, what are the questions? Not to say, don't ask. But what are the questions? And you'll find you can help the students way better. They might not even understand the issues as you understand them, but you don't want to listen because we don't see this place as dissent as this very big opportunity for progress and transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dissent as an opportunity to do better, to be better. The classroom is a site of struggle. And I think, to also cite Bell Hooks, it's also the site of greatest possibility. The classroom is a site of possibility. Thank you so much. So many rich reflections from the panel. I'm looking at the time, as I have to as chair, and I'm going to give us 15 minutes. That's all we have. 15 minutes. We have to finish at 1. 15 minutes for questions, comments. no papers, just questions or comments. Keep it succinct so that we can get as many comments and questions in the room. And I'm going to ask the panelists to respond as you feel. So is it okay to take at least 3 or 4? And then I think that's all we will have time for. I saw 3 hands there already and 1 hand here. I'm going to take those 3 and 1, and then we'll see if we have time for another round. Sorry. Okay. If you keep it short, we can get more questions in.
I am short, so I cannot keep it short. I'm Sarojini. I've been involved with this university with all the rectors this university had.
Oh, wow.
As a student from the 1960s up to the current rector now.
Wow.
So I've got limited experience of this university.
Limited.
My comment to the University of the Left, or whatever we will call it, the semantics with it. The last question I had to Jakes was when he finished his stint at the presidency. And I was meeting him outside here because he was coming to attend another function here. And I asked Jakes, now that we have a democracy, which we always take as a good thing, we don't question democracy as a good thing. And I asked him, what should we be now in terms of the University of the Left? And Jake's response to me in that chat was, it is critical support of the state. And that idea I could not pursue further with Jake's. And I think it's an idea that we should pursue further. What does it mean to critically support something that we call a democratic state?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Julie's expansive experience. Next. Who was next? On that side? No? Oh, I thought there were 3 on that side. Did I miss it? Oh, there we go.
Morning.
Good
My voice is
morning.
a bit hoarse, so I'm struggling a bit. I wanted to, I think this is just a comment with Dr. Fikile Vilakazi. I thought you were going to locate African feminism within the context of the left. So probably if you have a chance to respond, can you touch on that? And then I wanted to add or rather comment on what Prof had said, the first speaker, about leaving the definition of the left open-ended. I don't necessarily agree with that because it's one of the reasons why the definition of the left is so fragmented and it's so difficult for blacks to really locate themselves or to still keep the definition as a stable definition of what it is to be in the left. And then lastly, what Dr. Mandyoli said at the end about the classroom should be a site of struggle. The reality of UWC is that even within our curriculum, the classroom is not a site for struggle. I mean, I'm a law student, and it is seen as bizarre to have a conversation that is political. And political to some people means just saying that you're black and this other person is white. Like, that in itself is a problem. And how do we continue to have these conversations as the University of the Left if the university victimizes lecturers who do take that approach? And for example, Dr. Sinani, who was a lecturer of mine, I mention him in every room that I'm in because we know what the system did to him. And he was one of the only lecturers that actually managed within the law faculty to, his classroom would be full to the brim, and people were not even law students would join his lectures, which just shows that there is hunger to have these conversations. There's hunger to decolonize the curriculum, but is the university open to having that sort of transformation? It's one thing to initiate these dialogues, but is the space conducive for lecturers who want to transform, and bring it back to being the university of the left? That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There was one on the side, and then I think we will take one more if we can, because this is the only round that we can. Thank you.
Hello. I'm Arona Dyson. I'm in learning and teaching, and I've been involved with UWC since I started my PhD 23 years ago, and I'm now in a permanent post. My comments and questions are not going to, or my comment and question are not going to be popular. I'm Jewish. I know 3 other Jewish people at UWC. I'm sure there are a few more. And I want to comment on the discourse of the pro-Palestinian discourse that is very dominant at UWC, and particularly as manifested in the resolution that was passed by Senate Council, etc. I find that the discourse, as reflected in a very dominant discourse in the left globally, is incredibly one-sided, lacking in nuance. And I am devastated by what's been happening in Gaza and what is continuing to happen. And it doesn't, at this point, it just seems to keep getting worse. But if I just look as an example at the communications that I've been seeing coming out in the emails in UWC, initially there was the first communication, I think, was shortly after the 7th of October 2023, where Israel was condemned, but it was the Hamas attack on Israel was mentioned, and it was mentioned as a negative thing. Subsequently, I've not seen any criticism of Hamas and the role that they play in the conflict. And for example, on the 7th of October attack, the widespread rape of women was not condemned. The Gender Equity Studies Unit did not come out with any statement of condemnation. The kind of governing of Hamas, which is highly repressive of any critical comment, and there have been Palestinians who've been protest against Hamas, which was very harshly suppressed. So I think that I would like to say that if we are having dialogue and debate and discussion, that there should be space for not just a completely one-sided and homogenous kind of argument, but there should be space for other views, and people should not be silenced or feel silenced. Okay.
Thank you for your question and important 30 seconds.
Okay, I've also been here 30 years now, so
30 seconds.
Okay, I've also been here 30 years now, so it's long. I want to
1 second per year. Yes, thank you.
First, I want to compliment.
No. Straight to the question, please. Otherwise, I'm going to stop you.
I'm coming to the question.
Yes.
I want to compliment Prof. Balfour, because you see, he's opened up a space that Jakes had opened up.
Yes, and we've had the compliment. So can we move to the question?
So just hang on. Now, the issue is, and I mean, here I feel that he could also participate. The separation between the student struggles and the atomization of the student struggles, and even between universities. How can we get our academics and our administration to participate in the democratization of those struggles?
Thank you.
Rather than close it down.
We got the question. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we have 2, I think, more that were comments and 2 questions. critical, important questions. I am burning to answer one of them, but I won't. I'm going to ask our panelists to. Whoever, who wants to go first?
Thanks for those questions. Only one was really directed at me, which was the question about the definition of the left and my suggestion that it remain open-ended. Of course, it has to remain open-ended within parameters. The reason why, I mean, you know, if there are no parameters, then what is the left? Anything is the left, you know. The reason why I said it should remain open-ended, well, there are many reasons, but one is that it's always open to being enriched. I mean, you used the example of African feminism. There are many modes, or have historically been many modes of being Marxist that would not recognize something like the value of African feminism. And I don't think anyone ever has the kind of definitive scope of knowledge of everything to be able to say this is what it is. It's always open to expansion, but it goes beyond that. The academic left, I mean, I went to university in 1989. I don't know what it was like here earlier in the 80s, but certainly the academic left and post-apartheid South Africa has carried currents that are extremely dogmatic and sectarian and damaging to people and institutions and projects. And, you know, the questions that we've been asked to engage here are infinitely complex. We could never do it in the morning. We could never do it in a PhD. We could never do it in 10 years. They're ongoing conversations. But like any other discourse, making claims within it can also be an exercise of power. And an exercise of power dressed up in the kind of moralism which protects it from critique. So those are some of the reasons why I think it should be open-ended. I think none of us in this room should say, look, it's this, and if you don't think it's this, you're wrong. I don't think that's gonna get us anywhere.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Fikile?
Thank you very much. I'm just going to answer the question about African feminism just because of time. And thank you so much for asking that question. I think that it's important as we have this conversation about what do we revitalize and how do we revitalize and remember where we have been around the question of feminism within the university. The gender equity unit, which is where I'm sitting at the moment, I think becomes a point of reference in that conversation. Perhaps the women and gender studies, but things have evolved also to intersect within the various faculties and departments to do this feminist work. So UWC in the transition period, the gender equity unit particularly, I remember Rhoda Kadala, there's many others who have gone now, like Mary Hems. When Rhoda Kadali rose, actually she came from humanities. You know, as a researcher, as a feminist scholar and a thinker who said, the transitional conversation, the anti-apartheid conversation, there was just something about it that was patriarchal, that was sort of excluding certain voices. And I think she then came from that critical school of thought, amongst others, which included different forms of feminisms, but particularly embedding African feminism as a very important conversation of how we are becoming left. And it's a long story cut short moving forward to say that conversation of saying in our thinking left, we should not forget about the feminist politics that helps us and takes us to places of how we foreground conversations around gender, our being sexual beings. You know, when we enter institutions as gendered beings, as sexualized beings, as racialized beings, but as classed beings as well. And I think that conversation has been said. So that African feminist politic has really assisted the university in the last 30 years to understand that role, which is currently located within the gender equity unit. But I want to also problematize a little bit. I know I don't have time, just to say that I think in the revitalization process, it's important for us to really revitalize that conversation through intersectionality ways of working, through intersecting ways of existing together in this existential space. And for me, it's really about remembering that we are interconnected, we are interdependent, we need to work with each other because we need each other to foreground that conversation of what does it mean to be a gendered being in this particular ecosystem that we are as UWC. So African feminism is helping us, and there are many other schools of thought. It's about curriculum as well. The Women and Gender Studies, by the way, started as a program, but it became a department because of that intellectual feminist work that sits within what we know as a gender equity unit today. A lot has happened to stifle, that intellectual activism. And I think for me, it's always a contestation that says, what is that we reward as an institution? And it's about the people, right? Because people are the people that do the work of feminism, and it's not just women. In 1993, there were men within this institution who supported the feminist struggle against the anti-apartheid regime, which is what now we know as the GEU. There are many others. We see scholarship now within departments that's focusing on feminism, on gender. We see that being embedded in other places. But I think in moving forward to the institutional operational plan, it's very, very important not to forget the fact that we come here with our bodies. We come here from certain spaces. The personal is very political. And first and foremost, we are gendered beings, we are sexualized beings, and feminism helps us to understand that and nuance that work.
Thanks so much, Fikile. Thank you. Thank you also for reminding us about the intersectionality of the struggle. Rajendra, quickly.
Very short points.
Can you hear? Okay.
Three very short points. The first one is that we do not have a democratic state. And if that's the point that Jake Scarborough was making, he was stuck in that idealistic view of the Mandela regime. Yeah. But I think what we do have is a pseudo-democratic state, and we got to be very careful. It's a conduit for capitalism, and how we need to disrupt that in how we teach and what we do, etc. And we must gain our voice against the state and stop the allegiance. Second point is the curriculum transformation. We have a framework. I helped to draw it up, but it's business as usual. So we need to re-look curriculum transformation, especially how teaching and learning has to be foregrounded. Last point, we have to stand on the side of the oppressed. It's like asking us to listen and give voice to the Nationalist Party regime. Exactly. Why did you have white supremacy? Let's hear your voice. No, we cannot.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Lindo?
Yeah, no, the question, I think some of the questions Prof. Rajendra has answered, and I won't go there. I think it's a very generative question, this idea around opening up. Thanks for that question, Win, around opening, leaving it open-ended, this definition. And my thing about it would be the example of the United States. You know, the blue party in the United States, the Democrats, boldly call themselves the left. And we know that there's no real fundamental difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. And so that open-endedness, it gets abused in that sense. So I think the parameters, and this is where I agree with Prof, the parameters must be more clearly defined around an ethos and around values that are commonly shared, and not this idea that, no, you know, if you think you're progressive in your own space, we can call you left. No, we must be very clear and aggressive around these things. The second one is the question around, and it goes back to the question of abuse, because the point made around, you know, not listening, not looking at Hamas and all of those things is, again, we must not allow people to abuse the progressive nature of being left and democratic. There's nothing nuanced about killing children. There's nothing nuanced about settler colonialism, and we're not going to accept it. So this idea that we must have space for two, we can't have space for things that are inhumane in nature. Let us not think that being progressive and being, you know, nicely worded is what we find value or derive value from. We must be honest. And the honest thing is that the state of Israel is wrong.
It's an apartheid.
It's an apartheid state, and that there's not a war happening there. It is not. It's genocide. And if we're not clear about those things and we're not aggressive, we're going to allow people to open these conversations and have little spaces. What is happening there must be dismantled by the rest of the world. Clean.
Free pallets.
And the last point, around the question of democratizing these struggles, I think it's very important to note that part of this is a journey because, I mean, it has been said revolution is not an event, it's a process. So part of this is a journey of saying, how do we bring even those who have managerial tendencies now? We need to isolate people who are not progressive inside the university. If you're a dean and you're not progressive, we need to start showing that you're not progressive so that you can either move aside or you can change. Part of what I mean, I boldly come from this university. This university claims to be of the left. So even when they threaten to expel us during Fees Must Fall, I used to say, expel me so I can expose you that you are lying when you're saying you're progressive. So let us be clear about this thing around, even when we consider the new institutional operating plan, that we need to change the culture. And by the culture of being left, I mean not only the relationship that professors have with students, but even the relationship that students have with cleaning staff, that students have, that lecturers themselves have with the security, that lecturers have, and this idea of saying people who are in the residential services or in CSSS, the counseling, the ethos that needs to reverberate throughout this university needs to be consistent. That ethos is that we must humanize the experiences of all and sundry who are in these walls. And if we have that particular ethos, then we can democratize the space. Then I can disagree with Professor Robert Balfour aggressively, knowing that I have nothing personal against him. My love for the university transcends my agreement with him. Thank you.
Wow. There's so much, so much, so much, so much. It is only the beginning, I think, of the conversation. Thank you so much for this generous and generative conversation. I think it's like I say, I feel like I just want to say to be continued because it has to be continued. I don't think we're any closer to having a solid and a closed definition of the left. But like Richard is saying, maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the open-endedness of the idea. I think what we are clear on is that the left, to be left, is to take a position, and that position is not neutral. It's not about the balance. It's not about listening, just to the other side. It is about taking a preferential option for those who are marginalized, for those who are violated, for those who are oppressed. I think we can all agree on that particular definition. The other aspects of what that means in practice, etc., is something that we can talk about further, but I think that's a non-negotiable. If to my understanding, that's a non-negotiable about the left, that you are taking a preferential option for those who are most marginalized, those who are most oppressed, and those who are violated. On that note, I'm going to thank you all for your contributions, for the respectful ways in which you've engaged with each other, and I'm going to ask our rector to come up and say thank you to all of you again. And we have small tokens of appreciation for all our panelists, and the rector will hand these out. So for our first panel as well, get ready to come up when the rector calls you up. So thank you, Rector.
Thank you very much, everybody, for staying the course with us today, and also for the colleagues who were also online and stayed the course during that period. I think what emerges is the need for ongoing discussions of this kind. And when we initiated the dialogue series, we considered that we might have to have a deeper introspection as we go along. So I would like to suggest that the themes that have emerged from today and the questions that have been asked, that we have an opportunity to look them over and perhaps identify from those a further set of questions to pursue so that we have a good enough opportunity as university to engage at the level of deep introspection, but also community dialogue with each other around clarification, further exposition, and the like. So from my side, I'm really deeply appreciative and very humbled to be in the presence of many of our colleagues who have experience of the place, but also expertise to share with us from a variety of disciplines, as also a variety of life experience that was brought into the conversations. It means a lot to us that we listen at that level of care and humility. My job is a simple one at this point, which is to say thank you and to recognize both sets of panels that gave of their time today, gave us the opportunity to have insight to their thoughts. And so I'd like to read out the names and hand over a small gesture of appreciation, beginning with Prof. Crain, Soudien. Prof, if you could come up and accept this gesture of thanks from us. Thank you. And next up is Prof. Kelly Gillespie. Kelly, thank you very much. And our SRC President, Mr. Mcntosh Khasembe, thank you also very much. And then Prof. Moeniba Isaacs. Moeniba, thank you also for your contribution. And then Prof. Rajendra Chetty from our Faculty of Education. Rajan, thank you so much. Provocations to us today and the challenge very deeply felt. Thank you. And Dr. Lindokuhle Mandyoli from our Department of Political Studies. Thank you. It's appreciated. Thanks. And our very special Dr. Vilakazi from our Gender Equity Unit. Vilakazi. Thanks so much for being with us today. And last but by no means least, Dr. Richard Pithouse, our Distinguished Research Fellow. Richard, thank you. And I would be really remiss to not recognize our fantastic chair, who has made it possible for us to engage at a very deep level today, and also made it possible to facilitate the many questions and perspectives to be aired. So, Prof. Sarojini, thank you very much for everything. Thank you. So I'm going to hand over to Prof. Sean Pather to take us towards the closing, and thereafter we are all released. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rector and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Please put your hands together for the Rector, as many of you commented, who opened up the space. Thank you. And another round of applause for the facilitator and the panelists. I think we always knew that trying to do this in the space of 2 hours was going to be difficult, but it's a starting point, and I think we've done a lot this morning. A huge thank you to you all for being here in the cold and the rain. I want to say a big thank you to the organizing committee, which includes Prof. Singh and the team from Institutional Advancement, Gino and the team from AVS, Sarojini, Louise Dippener from Institutional Planning, all of whom came together to make this event, the first dialogue, a success. Just to say, going forward, the idea is that we will pull together a little task team to help shape a position paper for the university to help guide the way forward. But we require all of your inputs. Dr. Hoskins, who is here, has been the first who proactively has put forward his thoughts and opinion piece, and we will share that with the campus community. But I want to invite many of you around here who have thoughts, no matter how different they may be, to produce your thoughts as opinion pieces. And we will share it in the campus community as we go forward to find other ways to enable this dialogue to continue. So thank you all very much and have a good Friday further, and thank you for being here. Good afternoon.